Welcome to Part of the System. Today I'm with Ollie Dudfield. How are you going, Ollie?
Not too bad, David. Yourself?
Yeah, going really well, thank you. So a little bit about Ollie. Ollie is the Executive Director of Sport for Development Coalition in the UK. He leads the back-end team supporting collective action to create an enabling policy environment, measure impact at scale, and unlock new investments in using sport as a tool for positive social change. Now, prior to this, Ollie was at the Commonwealth Secretariat for Sports for Development and Peace, supporting 54 member countries. It's incredible, to enhance the contribution of sport for sustainable development. Now, in his role there, he spearheaded the intergovernmental organisation's globally recognised initiatives on sport and the Sustainable Development Goals. And over his career, Ollie's worked with multiple UN intergovernmental agencies, national governments, NGOs and sporting organisations on sports for development policy design, strategy and partnership projects. That is proper systems leadership right there, Ollie. He's the author of multiple publications on enhancing the contribution of sport and social and economic development. And I think you started your career in basketball, working as a coach and technical director in national systems back here in Australia and New Zealand. So I'm really excited to speak to you today, Ollie. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, cool. And before we start, you're obviously an Aussie in London and I'm an Englishman in Sydney. So who's got the better deal?
Well, in the introduction, you said a bit of a background on my side, working in a pseudo-diplomatic role across the United Nations system, intergovernmental system. So I'll take a diplomatic response and say there's benefits and positive assets in both countries. So I think I'll leave it there, not to start with a controversial response.
Well, before we finish, I might ask you who you think will win the Ashes, but I think I've definitely got the better deal, but I'll leave it there as well. So what does well-being mean to you, Ollie?
I think for me, reflecting on well-being, it's looking at multiple dimensions of well-being, and often there's a focus on physical aspect of well-being, mental or emotional aspect of well-being. So some of the sort of individual elements of well-being. But if there's probably one key reflection and takeaway I've had around some of the context that you said worked in, people, communities, been able to engage with, it's that there's an important social dimension of well-being, an important community dimension of well-being. And of course, we see that in the different dimensions of wellness and some of the work around that. So certainly, I think it's that holistic approach, which then, for me, calls into sharper focus a number of the key social determinants for health and well-being. And so, from my perspective, that really needs to be front and center when we consider sort of that holistic approach to well-being.
Yeah. So when you're talking about social in terms of health, shelter, food, obviously there are a couple of them, and then you can look at the rest of, the whole of person well-being. I agree with that. And in terms of like some of the things that you do to look after your well-being, then what's that look like?
That's a very good question, and whether it's what I would stand up and advise on versus stay very strict to is probably two separate questions. But I'll take the question as given.
Well, what do they say? Do what I say, not as I do. Is that right?
Yes. Again, I'll take the diplomatic response and say no comment. But I think there's a few elements, and I know, and I don't want to sound like I'm just towing the line for the work we're in, but I know when I'm more active, I do feel better.
Yeah.
So a combination of running and swimming, which is interesting, having been in a team sport and having been in a very dynamic sport, and the idea of staring at the bottom of a pool line sort of filled me with dread for a number of years. But as took it on a couple of years ago, found it somewhat cathartic, and likewise some of the elements have been active through running. But equally, and I think comes back to the aspect of the social dimension of well-being, connecting with people, be that in personal, professional sense. But I think also, and maybe a bit of a nudge or nod to this in the sort of career and what have you. But actually, I find quite important for well-being, engaging with people, different contexts, different cultures, different perspectives on various issues, various aspects, quite important for the well-being. And so I think, like a lot of people, there's been challenges over the last sort of 18 months because of some of the restrictions on that aspect. And then the last part is try to get the good balance between some of the focus on work-related elements, and then other elements of your life. And having previously been in a job, you said, where there's a lot of movement, like travel and what have you, can be challenges in that regard, as with a lot of aspects of sort of looking after your own sort of health and well-being. So that's what I try to do to support my well-being.
Yeah, and that social aspect, Ollie, I couldn't agree more. On Monday, when I was feeling just great, you know, I had all this energy, and I'm thinking, where did this come from? And then my partner Jen, she said, "Oh, well, you did catch up with a few people on Saturday, and you connected. You know, I had a picnic with some friends, and you don't realise, you know, that it's really important, that social connection." So yeah, I agree.
I think it's also an interesting element of the discussion around, and I spoke about a couple of individual activities, but probably because I spend a lot of the rest of my time sort of engaging with people from a whole range of backgrounds. But a discussion around individual physical activity versus group physical activity versus dynamic, and whether it be more traditional sport, whether it be dance movement, whether it be some other group orientated activities. I mean, quite interesting when we look, I think, both from a policy perspective, program perspective, what are the different and sort of multiple returns that can come from work across the system, which has a sport physical activity entry point, and that social interaction, academics might call the sort of bonding capital, bridging capital across groups, between groups. But I think it's always an interesting area that I personally reflect on, and certainly in different roles around in the system, certainly reflected on in policy and strategy.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's, you know, whether it's the individual or community or organization, or, you know, like the system that you're in, there's those different levers and intersection points, I think, what you're talking about. And since we're talking about systems, like, tell me about the work of the Sports Development Coalition. It's got the best title ever, by the way. But how does it fit into the system?
Well, it probably has it does have one key point of connection across. There's about over 200 organisations that make up the coalition, but they overarch thousands and thousands of projects and programs across the UK, because some are networks, some are organisations with multiple delivery areas, others are small place-based organisations. But essentially, across those 200 plus organisations, the point of connection is a commitment to using sport and physical activity to contribute to wider social outcomes. And what do I mean by that? Yes, health and well-being, but also supporting pathways back into education, supporting employability outcomes, or improving the employment prospects of those that are facing additional barriers to employment, supporting the reduction of antisocial behaviour or reducing reoffending, etc., etc. So it's that commitment to use this tool and asset to help support and contribute to those sort of wider positive social outcomes. Now, these are very complex issues, so sport-based interventions are not going to solve these issues, but certainly the coalition works deliberately and intentionally to use sport as an asset to contribute to these wider social outcomes. And then the second area that really links the coalition, I spoke before around some of the social determinants of health, some of the health inequalities, some of the broader inequalities that are growing and have been accentuated by COVID. There's a commitment across the coalition that the benefits of sport and physical activity, including the intentional use of sport and physical activity for wider outcomes, are enjoyed without discrimination and barriers. So then, to answer your question, the coalition works across multiple areas of the sport and physical activity system, and of course that system's interconnected with the education system, criminal justice system. It's interconnected in systems in different places, different areas, different contexts. So really, it's multidimensional, works with a range of stakeholders, and actually works to deliver or support and contribute to a range of different outcomes. So you've got stakeholders who might be very small charities, volunteer-led or single, right through to some of the bigger networks of sport for development, community sport organisations in the UK, like Street Games, like Sport Ed, some of the community club organisations, foundations of professional sport, etc., etc. So difficult to answer your question precisely, but that's the nature of system working.
Yeah. I think it just shows you the depth of all the outcomes that you're trying to reach through sport, right? And all the different stakeholders and all the different levels and systems that you talk about. And we could go into each one of those and speak for hours on it. But the one that I would like to just unpack a little bit, I suppose, is the health inequality bit, and there's obviously a big agenda through the UK at the moment with leveling up, as you're calling it. And, do you think that hopefully there's been a shift, but, are we able to change the trajectory of where we've been going with health inequality widening and chronic disease, on the rise? What's your thoughts on that, Ollie?
There's probably two main thoughts. One is there is I wouldn't say growing awareness, because there's been that awareness of those health inequalities and how they intersect with physical activity levels and the inequalities in physical activity for a number of years. But there's, whether in policy, strategy, or sort of the way that the organisations across the system are responding, there's a growing pivot to say, well, there needs to be changes in the way the system operates to explicitly work to address these inequalities. And we've got examples from across the coalition of reforming governance models, reforming delivery models to ensure that the opportunities for people to engage in sport physical activity interventions are governed and led by the communities in which they're trying to serve. So that change, then right through to much been made of the new Sport England strategy, uniting the movement, and really at the core of that is tackling these inequalities. So that's the first reflection, that's I suppose a positive in that in that regard. But the realities of the inequalities and the accentuation of those inequalities on the basis of COVID are stark. We know, and let's just take physical inactivity. You see this in the UK or in England in particular. I'll take the data from England. There's about 37% of adults are not physically active for health benefits. It's about 55% of children and young people, school-going children and young people, based on the different chief medical officer recommendations. Now, you put that against, say, socioeconomic status, and it's about 71% of those in professional grade jobs are active. As you go down, it's about a 10% drop as we start to look at that classification of socioeconomic status. We know that gender, we know ethnicity, all contribute. So I think we're facing a real challenge in this regard, and so that brings me back to the policy and strategy aspect is quite important.
Mm.
One of the other defining principles that I suppose the sport for development world works on is intentionality of design. And that principle sounds a bit jargony and what have you, but really assessing the outcomes and working that you want to achieve, working back from there and making sure all elements of program design delivery are intentionally aimed at, in this case, we're talking about addressing some of the barriers and inequalities. So, yeah, we've seen a good shift into some of the policy and strategy to an extent. We have critical that sort of very intentional design. It won't just happen. Is absolutely important. But certainly, I think those who are passionate about the health and well-being benefits that can come from sport and physical activity need to continue to be aware of and honest around the level of inequalities and what that means for governance, what that means for leadership, what that means for investment, what that means for how we sort of organise and deliver across the system.
And thanks for providing that context, and sounds like we've got a lot of work to do when you talk about COVID and the recovery. In terms of the programs that you're involved in, because there's obviously quite a big breadth of that. You talk about employment and training, or getting people into sport from prison or whatever it may be. And I'm just giving them two of examples. How are you measuring that stuff, Ollie, in terms of them outcomes, that social value stuff?
Yeah, really on two levels. And one area, and you spoke before around the sort of levelling up agenda, and it's an important agenda and policy position of the current government. And so on that level, some of the importance of what I might call the macro level measurement in terms of what are the contributions at scale that the sector can make towards some of the really key elements of that agenda. So levelling up health and well-being, levelling up some social opportunities. So we know pre-COVID, for example, there's work that modelled out about 85 billion return from sport and physical activity, community sport and physical activity in England in terms of social and economic value, and about 71 billion on the sort of social value element. And those sort of macro measures are quite important. But I think when we talk about the macro measures, we go beyond that and try and, if you like, emphasize some of the decisions that decisions makers can make. And I often say, when we're talking about measurement at that policy and macro level, and then why we're doing it, we're doing it not just to have applause, but we're asking for action. And I think that issue around that macro level measurement is quite important. And so we know, for example, that if there's 500,000 people more active, so get to levels of activity for health, in terms of physical health and well-being, you're adding on about 130, 140 million of social value, and then over about 600 million in value in terms of well-being. So you start to say, well, actually, if we can put the policies in place that move us on a trajectory to get more people active, there's greater returns to the public purse, it's greater returns in terms of social and economic value. So in one sense, that macro piece is quite important. And I would say that probably as a sector more broadly, we probably have been perhaps often more focused on the measurement evaluation of individual projects, individual programs, and putting forward the results, the learning, the insight from an individual intervention and program, and perhaps not as focused on coming together collectively and saying, well, our collective work at scale delivers this value. If we have these decisions made and these actions taken, it could actually deliver this level of value. If, however, XYZ is done or not done, the value might drop off. So that macro piece is one. Probably the second comment, or the second sort of real focus on measurement and evaluation, and this is when we start to get to the program and project intervention, is comparability. And that is using some of the measurement tools, validated measurement tools that are utilized across health, that are utilized in criminal justice, that are utilized in education, and ensuring that those tools are utilized when we're talking about interventions that are aimed at those outcomes. So I'll give you an example. One of the organisations in the coalition, Dame Kelly Holmes Trust, it supports elite athletes, trains them as mentors using a very youth work mentoring curriculum, and then uses that, I suppose, social capital they have to engage with young people, but ensures they've got those mentoring skills, almost youth work skills, rather than just relying on the fact that they're an athlete. They use, one of the tools that they use is the Warwick Edinburgh wellbeing scale, validated, well recognised within the health sector, well recognised within mental health professionals.
I think Mind use that as well, don't they, for their stuff? Yeah.
And so over last year, I think they saw a sort of 7.5 point increase in results from pre to post across their participants. Now that gives you credibility when you talk to some of the skeptics. So, well, what's the role of sport or physical activity in our world? As the coalition, we've been working. There's about 50 organisations in the coalition that are working on utilising some essentially collective shared measurements that draws on some of the Office of National Statistics data points and questions around wellbeing, the ONS4 they're called, some questions from the Community Life Survey, which is a whole of government survey that looks at things like trust in neighbours, and then some of the sort of physical activity measures. And what that allows is the sort of ability for both collective data to be presented outside of our system and sector, and the credibility and comparability of the results that we achieve within sport and physical activity. Because sometimes we have that danger of sort of only facing inwards or being very anecdotal in terms of the results. We might give a case study or might give an inspirational story, but we increasingly need to back that up with validated and comparable evidence. That said, we shouldn't also underestimate the critical importance of context-specific and program-specific, intervention-specific, community-specific participatory approaches to understand what's working in what context and why. Because the reason that we should measure and evaluate is not to prove things to X, Y, and Z, but actually to improve our interventions, improve our programs for those that are actually working on delivering and are part of those programs. So, excuse me if that was quite a sort of passionate response to that, but it's something that I think it's really important question that we reflect on as a sector, as a system.
No, thanks for sharing that, Ollie. And you know what's coming up for me is that that consistency of data, I think, data sets, you know, and it sounds like collectively, you know, with all your kind of groups within your coalition, you're all working towards those, so are all measuring the same outcomes, because then it becomes really powerful to be able to tell a story, doesn't it? Whether you're advocacy or educating, you know, towards government and trying to get a lot of funding, because we all know sport makes people feel good, and you know, physical activity, and you know, but it's we do need the data behind it as well, I think, and I don't think we've been as good as we've, you know, as we can be at kind of delivering, well, being able to showcase that.
Yeah, and I think also then, what's the insight that we can garner from that data, from the results, and probably a more challenging area, using that insight, and I said it before, to ask decision makers to make decisions, because often we are guilty of telling stories and where we're after sort of applause, and that's important, raising awareness, education, and what have you. But I think taking that a step further and saying, you know, for example, if we have direct investment in ensuring that public leisure and public school facilities can be open to community groups that are working with the most either vulnerable on society or those who face additional barriers to be active, as opposed to just being opened on a commercial footing. Then actually we can sort of predict or envisage these improvements in health and well-being, these returns on investment in this community, in this region, in this state, in this country. And so then there's the decision to be made, and I don't want, it's not a sort of it's not a binary of commercial versus community outcomes, but certainly we know, say in figures I spoke to before, around a 71 billion return pre-COVID on community sport and physical activity in England. The modelling that drew out those figures also looked at the inputs. Where's the investment coming from? And there's about 21 billion of investment, so around a 4-to-1 return on investment. But what's interesting, only about 2 billion, 2.1 comes from public money. So the rest comes from volunteering, and that's about 5 or 6 billion of it. And then the other 13 billion comes from people paying. So that starts to sort of say, well, either on one sense that's, well, the market's working, or on the other hand, it's meaning that cost isn't the only barrier. There's a whole range of complexities, but it does mean that is there an argument, a bit of a rebalance on some additional public investment in this space to ensure that some of those barriers that might be there, based on some of the inequalities that we spoke to, are not stopping people enjoying the benefits of being active, or the benefits of being involved in programs that are looking at supporting sort of multiple returns on investment, the health and well-being, but also employability, education pathways, etc., etc.
And you mentioned leisure there and facilities, Ollie. So obviously the UK went through austerity and a lot of cuts to services and facilities, and then we've had COVID again, and I've read a lot in terms of councils cutting services and facilities closing and things. What can we do about that? Is there, is it a political decision? Like you talk about health and well-being. Is this a point in time where it's like we can't continue to do the things that we've always done? We need to change and do things differently. Yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
What is a challenging fiscal environment, and that's not just in the UK. That's globally. In particular, in the sort of following COVID and the health, social, and economic elements. So decisions have to be made around investment and public investment. That said, certainly those in the public leisure sector would say that there's a need for evolution and change, and we work with, for example, UK Active and the local government association on an emerging sort of national sector group where those different areas of the system, alongside Sport and Recreation Alliance, which traditionally work with a lot of the sort of more formal sports system, the Youth Sport Trust, the leading youth sport charity, and the Chartered Institute of Management of Sport and Physical Activity, alongside active partnerships. It's a long list, but important.
It is. So that when you talk about pulling all them different stakeholders together and the different agendas, and it could be tricky.
Yeah, definitely. But I think it's important also that those different elements of our system are able to come together and say, well, look, as a collective, these are the contributions we can make to, and you said that levelling up agenda, building back better, the cross-government priorities. And the reason I bring that up in the response to the question about public leisure is, one, you've got two actors there: local government association supporting a significant amount of public leisure facilities, and UK Active working a lot with the fitness and leisure sector, who are part of that contribution and that collective of the sector. And I think whichever part of the sector we're in, showing that actually there can be multiple returns on investment is important because of the point I made around decisions have to be made. And we often talk about the public health agenda, and it's critical, the public health agenda, for the role of sport, of physical activity, of movement, of fitness, and an argument, well, it might be investment in this part of facilities due to the public health outcomes. Now, I spent significant amount of time working and engaging with ministries of health, working with WHO and what have you. And of course, the issue of non-communicable disease, the issue of the health burden of non-communicable disease is high on the agenda. There's, in previous role, working in the Caribbean, working in the Pacific, the burden of non-communicable disease was substantial and debilitating across countries, across economies. But equally, physical inactivity is the fourth leading risk factor and cost implication of non-communicable disease, behind smoking, alcohol, and diet. And so what you've got, even within that area of preventative health, there's decisions being made in preventative health. And so I think with that, it's quite important that as a system, as a sector, whether it be around investment in public leisure, whether it be in other areas, green space, whether it be in the revenue or resource investment in our workforce, because not just about buildings, in the workforce, in supporting those who are delivering the activities, understanding, talking to, and being able to demonstrate the multiple returns on investment is quite critical and quite important. And some of that comes back to where we started, around some of those social dimensions of well-being, and then some of the inequalities and some of the health inequalities, some of the inequalities to access. So that public leisure space, it's what reforms can be undertaken to ensure that those who have traditionally not been able to access those sort of public facilities are able to access. And I'm not sure a straight cost commercial model is the way. Something we focus on quite significantly in the coalition. We just looked across a large 7 of sort of the key organisations in the coalition, and trying to understand what was the demographic of the participants in terms of the areas of deprivation they sort of came from. And across the 7 programs, close to sort of 50,000 participants, there was 55% from the 30% most deprived areas of the country. And so that's important in terms of being able to engage, whether it be young people, whether it be across the life stage. Those so often are disproportionately inactive. And again, reinforcing the other point made, what's the sort of difference between open the doors of a centre vis-a-vis a sort of sport for development approach, the intentionality. There might be workforce leaders from within the communities that we're talking about. There's very clear sort of potentially non-traditional methodologies utilised to help people engage, get active, stay active, understand some of the social and cultural barriers, understanding some of the importance of that leader, coach, workforce mentor, whoever it is that's helping to support the activities. So there's some lessons to be learnt there for public leisure. There's also some lessons for some of the community-orientated actors to learn from colleagues in public leisure. Hence that interconnection of the system being absolutely critical if, as a collective, we're going to make our contribution across different areas of society and across different government agendas.
Great explanation there, Ollie. Thank you for that. And what comes up for me is you talked about Sports England and the Uniting the Movement agenda, and it's more about improving health inequality or reducing health inequality, and it even has in there about proportionate universalism and providing more support to those most in need. I'd love to get to a position where we do have these facilities and we open them up for those that are most in need. I think that's what are they there for at the end of the day, if they're not there for the community.
Yeah, there's some of the interesting part, what we consider a space and facility as well. So earlier was this year. I check my years. Yeah. There was the launch of a community ownership fund by the UK government. Essentially, that was supporting community groups to take on and provide them support to sustainably manage sort of local community facility. It might be community halls, might be community centres and what have you. There's a strong focus there on the ability of those type of spaces to be within communities, and in being within communities, being spaces where people could be supported to connect. So that element of social well-being, but equally then spaces for different, perhaps more inclusive types of physical activities without some of the barriers of the big shiny leisure centres. So I think there's also a question there in policy as we get down to local government and get down to local policy in terms of what is the right type of investment, the right type of facility, the right type of space that can really help alongside the workforce and alongside the way we intentionally design interventions or programs, that sort of triangulation that can help address some of these inequalities, because the substantial large facilities aren't for everyone. And I think the importance of that diversity of investment is a really key point as we look at strategy and policy going forward. And back to another point I made before, what's the return on investment for investment in X type of facility versus Y type of facility? And you're probably aware in a few weeks, the leaders, global leaders, will be descending on Glasgow for COP 26. And so that element of another dimension of well-being, environmental well-being, is another key issue that we need to raise up our agenda as a sector. We know in the UK, depending on the local authority area, the public leisure estate is worth between 10 and 40% of emissions. We know that there's challenges around some of the open green space that is critical for both environmental well-being and to help people be active. So the implications of that aspect of wellness and well-being is pretty important too when we look at future policy and strategy.
And just to round off what you were saying there about the facilities, being shiny and not for everybody, I think sometimes, Ollie, going to a leisure facility for me and you, it's like, for us going to the Australian Open, people just don't think it's for them. And I think we throw around the words breaking down barriers all the time, but to mention an organization you talked about before, like street games, it's like, we can have activity in anywhere, can't we? It can be a car park. It doesn't really matter. And giving that ownership back to communities, through place-based, which I know a lot of what the work that you do. And I'm lucky enough to have spoken to a few people, on part of the system, and each community is different. They know what they need. I think it's that empowerment, enabling, and I love that you keep using the word intentional design. Because we can't just do this cookie cooker approach all the time. The same programs don't apply everywhere, do they?
No. And you spoke before about evaluation, monitoring, evaluation, learning. I think there's a key metric here which we don't dive into enough as a system, as a sector, and it's capital versus revenue spend, or capital versus resource spend. So the spend in the philosophy, if you build it, they will come, versus actually supporting the people and the diversity of people, those who are embedded in place, embedded in neighbourhood, embedded in community, who can really support breaking down some of the barriers to being active and enjoying the benefits of sport and physical activity. For me, there's an imbalance between the spend of both public and in some way private investment on the capital, the buildings, vis-a-vis the people, and those people who actually understand the communities and understand those with diverse lived experience, diverse backgrounds, and can really help engage, encourage, and ensure that they can enjoy the benefits of sport and physical activity. So that capital versus revenue question is an absolute, for me, essential sort of policy and and strategy. And we've probably got to do better as a system and a sector in terms of, again, giving the decision makers decisions which are easier in terms of what is the revenue investment that we're asking for and what are the returns and the value that that's going to bring. Because it's easy to say, please build this facility, please invest in this. And often we fall in the trap of the sort of, I always call it the field of dreams scenario. If you build it, they will come. Well, that's not the case. And without the people and the intentionality of the program design, the stark inequalities of participation that we see tell us that they won't come just because we build or have the space. And I think that is a sort of guiding principle for policy and program policy and strategy is quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me, Ollie, from a leadership point of view, you talk about the system quite a bit and all these different stakeholders within, the ecosystem, I suppose we could call it. Like, what's one of your, what's one of the things that you do in your approach in terms of, working with all these multi stakeholders across different layers? What's important for you as a leader?
Yeah, there's a great sort of section of Alice in the Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland? Yeah, Alice in Wonderland.
I didn't think you were going to go there.
No. Well, and I think it's when Alice first goes down the
rabbit hole,
I guess. But basically, means I think the rabbit character and the rabbit sort of she asks, where am I? Essentially, so where do you want to go? And she says, I don't know. Where should I go? And he says, well, it doesn't matter. He says, if you don't know where you're going, well, it doesn't matter where you go, does it? And the point being that actually, unless we kind of know the destination, unless we know the outcome, it's actually very difficult to be able to look at that sort of intentional design, look at our assumptions, and look at what needs to be addressed to get to that outcome. So sort of that start at the end and work backwards. And that served me very well, particularly that the majority of my life and career has been spent working with actors outside of sport and physical activity. And I'll tell you the number of times I've sat with a permanent secretary or a minister and introduced with the word sport, and they're not a sports minister, they're not a permanent secretary responsible for sport or physical activity or even health, although someone's health, it's sort of that the eyes shut over and they sort of, this isn't my. So starting with the outcome. Okay, there's issues with reoffending. 18 to 21-year-olds in the UK, the reoffending rate's 26%. We have a cross-section, a case study across 5 different programs of 18 to 21-year-olds in sport-based re-entry reoffending programs. The rate is 11%. There's a significant rate. I think there's projected unemployment of the peak and still looking like at the end of this year around 12%, significantly higher for young people, significantly higher from those who are already in long-term unemployment. There's sport-based employability programs. I think we looked across 8 leading sport-based employability programs. 59% of the young people involved go on to an education, employment, or training outcome. So you're able to start with, well, the issue is youth unemployment, and these are some of the complexities around that. The issue is, there is a real challenge around reoffending. The issue is there are challenges around social cohesion. Start with the outcome that we're trying to contribute towards, and then be able to work backwards in terms of the contribution that sport and physical activity can make. If we put that in a health and well-being sense, with all the dimensions of health and well-being, the social terms, the health inequalities. Now, of course, the outcome is not performance or competitive results, or it is actually more people from more diverse backgrounds who are traditionally inactive are enjoying the health and well-being benefits of movement, of being active. And there's very different policy interventions, very different intentional design, and different skills, knowledge, behaviours of the workforce, and different spaces and places for them to get active that are required than sort of traditional thinking. So I think to come back to your question, it is starting with the outcome, Making sure if you go down into the wonderland of some of the complexity of the areas you're working in, you're very clear about what the results are, the impact that we're trying to contribute to, and then working backwards from there. And I know that sounds a bit of a sort of technocratic response as opposed to a sort of there's other elements of leadership, the interpersonal and what have you. But I do think that's a absolutely critical area of leadership within our system. And within the area of work that we're in.
Well, now that I'm always going to think about you as Alice in Wonderland. But I agree, you have to be fluid, but having the end in mind, I think is really important. And so thank you for that. And I know you have to jump off soon, so we're going to fly through these last three questions because I do want to squeeze them in, Ollie. We talked about chronic disease. Obviously, it's getting worse. If you could nudge one part of the system to improve the the well-being of people in the UK, what would that be?
In relation to chronic disease, I think it would be the awareness, training, development of those within the primary and secondary clinical care pathways. The Public Health England just released a report on a systems-based approach to physical activity. And it said one of the key barriers was actually the understanding of the community sport, physical activity, sport for development sector of those within the clinical pathway. And so I think the ability, and particularly in a system with free point of care health, the ability to actually improve the awareness that it's not just traditional sports clubs, not just leisure centres that can support those who have chronic health issues and therefore need significantly different offers of sport and physical activity. So the community groups, the voluntary community social enterprise organisations, those place-based organisations that are providing sport and physical activity opportunities in the community, for the community, ensuring that awareness and understanding and linkages there are from the clinical and secondary health pathway would be probably the key nudge.
I love it. And we all move differently, don't we? It doesn't have to be all elite sport. And that social prescribing stuff is coming out for me there, is what you're saying as well. And where do you see yourself personally in the system, and how do you contribute and influence it?
That's a good question. I think as someone who's come from the system, you said I was a basketball coach, more in that sort of on that sort of elite trajectory. That's many, many lives ago, and spending a good couple of decades now understanding better some of the perspectives of those in central government, some of the perspectives of those in civil society and the development sector outside of sport, some of those decision makers that we spoke about, understanding their perspective on sport and physical activity, and framing our offer, articulating our value proposition based on some of their assumptions, some of their skepticism, and some of their different views on our sector, on being active, on sport and physical activity. There's not a panacea. And actually, we need to understand that is for a number of decision makers, a number of community members, a number of leaders, whether a neighbourhood, place, system, national level, we have to make the argument. And the argument is not saying we have the panacea, but it's actually saying this is the contribution that can be made to these wider outcomes, these wider priorities of your neighbourhood, of your community, of your system, of your state, of your country. And this is the action we need from you. Not the applause, this is the action that we need, the type of investment, the type of policy, the type of leadership in your neighbourhood community to ensure that more people enjoy the benefits that participating in sport and physical activity can bring. So I guess debunking the panacea argument and trying to bring the perspective of those that I've worked with over a number of years from outside the system and sector to how we drive policy and strategy within the sector.
Fantastic. What a rich conversation, Ollie. There's a lot in that today. So just really appreciate you, giving me your time, and I love the work that you're doing over there in the UK. Maybe we can get you back over here where you belong, and trying to support and enable sports development and health in Australia. So I just wanted to thank you for today. And I did say I would ask you one last question. Who's going to win the Ashes?
Remember the first question when I said
Diplomatic.
put on my diplomatic background and say as long as there's a awareness around the Ashes of the importance of the diversity of different offers people need in the community to get active and enjoy the benefits of sport and physical activity, then cricket and sport will be the winner.
Oh, I tell you, there's a reason you've got to where you have, isn't there, with answers like that? So too funny. Well, yeah, thanks for today. And is there anything else you wanted to add before we jump off?
No, I think I'm worried there'll be other questions following on from the Ashes questions. So, look, David, thanks for the conversation. Been enjoyable discussion from my side as well.
Yeah.
And appreciate work you're doing to really put this sort of systems thinking, place-based thinking on the radar. So enjoyed the discussion, and best wishes moving forward.
Cool. Well, I'll let you jump off for your 9 a.m. meeting over there, and I'll settle down for my evening. So awesome, Ollie. Well, good to speak to you, and hope to catch up with you soon in person one day.
Likewise. Cheers, David.
See you, mate. Bye.